Hi everyone, welcome back to Matterhorn and to the latest video in my Elder Scrolls 6 for a New Generation series. We will be covering cities and towns in this video. It is interesting that one of the defining features of Skyrim, its cities and towns, has become a part of the game that now feels dated. When Skyrim originally released in 2011, the scope of the cities was massive. Not only that, but they were numerous. Most video games of that time period didn't have a city the size of Whiterun, and Skyrim had 5. On top of that, there were a dozen more smaller towns and settlements to explore. And yet, nearly a decade later, those cities that once seemed wide open, bustling, and alive now feel sparse and barren. Technology has changed, and now the expectation is Novigrad in The Witcher 3, Los Santos in Grand Theft Auto 5, or even several of the cities in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. My point is that Elder Scrolls 6 has a lot of changes to make in order to, in the early 2020s, compete in the next generation of consoles and PCs. By the time the Elder Scrolls 6 releases, we will have played Cyberpunk 2077. Since that game is not yet released, we don't yet know how realistic the city will be. By all accounts though, it is huge and can be interacted with in many ways. Already, based on what we've seen, this is likely to be the gold standard in a video game city. Given that it is CD Projekt Red developing it, and they've been working on it since before The Witcher 3, chances are that they will deliver on their vision. The part of Tamriel Bethesda decides for the setting of the Elder Scrolls 6 will likely have at least something to do with how they approach the number of large cities in the game. In Oblivion, there was the Imperial City. By today's standards, that once sprawling major city comes off as a barren, desolate wasteland. At the time it released, it was an achievement in gaming. In Skyrim, there were several large cities. Increasingly, these seem small by today's standards as well. Take Whiterun, for example. When I first played Skyrim years ago, I spent dozens of hours in and around this city. But if you pull back and look at it, there are maybe a dozen houses for all of the cities and residents. Compare that to the city of Novigrad in The Witcher 3. So, what does Bethesda do? Well, they need to exceed what we expect currently, and as I mentioned before, The Witcher 3 is a good baseline. For all of the things that it does well, the city, as big as it is in many ways just a series of corridors. Most of the buildings cannot be entered. In Skyrim, you could enter or break into every single building you came across. This is one of everyone's favorite features in the game. There simply aren't any areas that Bethesda doesn't allow you to access. The Witcher 3 was ambitious in city size in most ways, and maybe CD Projekt Red intended, at some point, for every building to be accessible. But the end result is that there are only certain areas that can be accessed. This makes the city feel artificial. If Bethesda decides to go the Oblivion route and have one giant city, they can go all out with everything, and more people expect from a modern video game city. This includes the following locations, and in numerous quantities: districts within the city, roads with actual traffic, signs of commerce everywhere, prisons, markets, city squares, theaters, residential areas, a port, government buildings, banks, blacksmiths, taverns, and the list goes on. If Bethesda doesn't have the resources to replicate a city like this many times over, instead, build one of the best that has ever been created in a video game. Every door should be accessible, with NPCs that live or work there. We are talking potentially thousands here to make the city really feel alive. It is ambitious. But then again, this is the Elder Scrolls 6 we are talking about. Smaller towns are a staple of the Elder Scrolls series. The good news for Bethesda is that their larger cities from Skyrim, such as Whiterun or Solitude, would fit nicely in this category. If we are going to have one massive city, then towns are smaller, so the bigger ones from Skyrim would be sufficient here. Still, Bethesda needs to add more NPCs to interact with. At the time of Skyrim's release, these cities felt lived in, and people walking everywhere to and from their jobs with daily activities was a really innovative feature. Now they look and feel sort of wooden. No one really deviates from their routine, and in the cities, people don't have anything else to do. Take Red Dead Redemption 2, for example. Most of the towns in this game are small and suffer the same issues that Skyrim does, with the exception of Saint Denis. That is a massive city that feels truly alive, with multiple taverns and places to go for its inhabitants, though it too also suffers from the problem of empty corridors that The Witcher 3 does. Still, you traverse the city even on horse, and it takes some time to get from one end to the other. It is a good starting point, along with Novigrad, for Bethesda to consider when creating a major city in the Elder Scrolls 6. Real cities have suburbs, not just homes that people live in. A real city is filled with apartments and other areas that are densely packed with people who live there. Outside of the city are generally the more wealthy or family-oriented inhabitants. They travel into the city to go to work, but then they leave and they go back to the suburbs to live. This was and is a real thing throughout history. The Witcher 3 even has suburb-type cities outside of the larger ones. It is realistic and something one would expect from a new entry in the Elder Scrolls to incorporate. Bethesda even sort of did this in some of their towns in Skyrim. Outside of Windhelm and Whiterun are stables, some houses, breweries, and farms, for example. Again, adding these requires more NPCs, but more NPCs allows for more opportunity for player interaction and quests than one wouldn't necessarily expect. A truly large city has suburbs, so if Bethesda creates a huge metropolis, they need to also create the accompanying suburbs to go with it. Finally, one of the parts of Skyrim that felt genuine were these houses that were sort of off the beaten path, out in the middle of nowhere. These are rural locations. In the real world, there are a lot of people that live in what are considered to be rural areas. Bethesda did a great job of peppering the landscape with locations and NPCs that were out in the wilderness. In a medieval setting, this was not uncommon. People worked large tracts of lands far away from major cities. There's not much work to be done here because Skyrim did it so well. It was always worthwhile as you wandered in the wilderness to stop at a house off by itself. Bethesda did a great job of making it worth your time to investigate the location. Sometimes somebody lived there and you could interact with them. Other times it was an abandoned house with a story to tell. And yet, still others, there may be enemies waiting to attack you if you interrupt them from partaking in whatever nefarious activities they were involved in. I just included these in the Cities and Towns video because I don't want Bethesda to forget that finding these locations on the map is also a part of what made Skyrim so great for its time. A large city that feels alive and that you could imagine yourself living in should be the goal for Bethesda. I am pragmatic. I don't think they can likely build multiple cities in the Elder Scrolls 6 that fit this description, but they can do one of them, and in my opinion, they will have the opportunity to build the biggest and most robust video game city we will have ever experienced by the time the Elder Scrolls 6 releases. What I really want them to avoid is creating more cities on the level of what they created in Skyrim. If that happens, the game will immediately feel dated the first time you enter the city and realize you can run from one end to the other in under a minute. However, given the number and quality of games that have released since Skyrim did, with cities far larger than Skyrim's, that gives me hope that Bethesda takes their existence as a challenge to be overcome in the Elder Scrolls 6. Thanks for watching the latest in my Elder Scrolls 6 for a New Generation series. Next time, we will cover crafting.